I hear the soft reverberations of my voice, so I guess you can all hear me too. Yep, I'll take that as a resounding yes. You can all hear me. You just had lunch, I'm taking it, so feel free to nod off. I have so much content to show you today that I'm going to dispel with the pleasantries and just get straight into it, other than saying my name is Damien Edwards, for those who have not seen me talk before. I'm a program manager on the ASP.NET team, and I'm going to show you a whole bunch of stuff today. Before that, quick refresh. How many people are using Visual Studio 2012? Yep, that's what I thought. Seeing amazing uptake of that version of VS, which is really good. Of those who are using it, how many people have updated to the Update 2? Good. So not as many. So I strongly encourage people who are using Visual Studio 2012 to, when the little balloon comes up and says updates to Visual Studio are available, don't ignore it. Click it and go and update Visual Studio to 2012 Update 2, because the web team shipped a whole bunch of stuff in Update 2, which was previously part of the ASP.NET 2012.2 release. I know it's not confusing at all, but they do have very similar names, but they do contain the same thing in terms of web tooling. Whole bunch of stuff in there, incredible tooling refreshes, support for less editing, CoffeeScript, really nice CSS editor improvements, and some new framework versions. But even though that was only, 2 months ago, we have not stood still. And today, I'm not going to show you any more slides other than to recap at the end. We're just going to go straight in, and I'm going to start showing you some really cool stuff. And before I do that, I'm going to get my notes out so I don't forget anything. All right, let's switch over. So we are looking at a new version of Visual Studio here. I believe this was announced this morning, Visual Studio 2013 Preview. That's about as much as I'm going to say about that, other than the name. But I am going to show you a whole bunch of new stuff to do with ASP.NET. So I've said File New Project here. And the first thing you'll notice is how anemic this dialog looks now. It's really very light on. And even that portable class library entry will go away soon. That's just a bug at the moment. When you say File New and choose Web now, you just see one application type, ASP.NET Web Application. No more upfront choice where you have to think about, well, did I want dynamic data? Did I want MVC? Did I want web forms? Am I building a control? It's like, nope. You just want to build an ASP.NET app? We've got you. Just click on that, and then you're presented with a new dialog, which is what we call our One ASP.NET dialog. Who's heard of this One ASP.NET idea that we've been throwing out for a while? Yep, a couple of hands. Scott Hanselman has done a talk on it. A few talks, actually. I've done a talk on it. And it's this idea of really unifying our tooling and framework story and embracing the idea of a hybrid ASP.NET app. Because at the end of the day, ASP.NET is just ASP.NET. It doesn't matter at runtime whether you use web forms or MVC or web pages or web API or ASMXs or WCF or SignalR or any of those things. It's all part of ASP.NET. And you can use them all together. So we want to build a tooling experience and a common components experience that really reinforces that story. To date, we haven't done a great job on that. If you chose MVC up front, it was an MVC project. If you didn't choose MVC up front, good luck trying to get MVC working in that project. And I can tell a few people have tried. Now, I am happy to announce these are just various flavors of one type of project system. So I can choose web forms, I can choose MVC, I can choose web API. And you'll note these little boxes down here, this add folders and references for updates as I click these. So web forms, it's grayed out and enabled because I have to use it, MVC, web API, mobile, Facebook, etc., etc. I'm going to choose web forms for this demo. Let's go ahead and create that, because I still like web forms. It has its place. Plenty of people are using it. Millions of applications deployed using web forms, which means it's not at all dead, because if it was dead, it wouldn't be here anymore, and no one would be using it. But plenty of people are using it. We're going to wait for this to install, and we're going to run it up immediately, and you're going to see the very, very first thing that will jump out at you that's changed about these project templates. So let's just Control F5 that to get that loaded. I am running inside a VM here, so if it seems a little slow compared to normal application development, then that's why. Compiling, big reveal. Okay, does this look familiar to anybody? So we're using Bootstrap. Bootstrap is a CSS layout and theming framework that was originally built by some developers at Twitter. It was called Twitter Bootstrap for a long time, now just known as Bootstrap. And it's now used by default in all of our templates. In the previous release, we did a whole bunch of custom CSS work and unified our templates. And while they looked okay, it was all custom. So if you wanted to change it or you wanted to add a different theme, you basically had to rewrite it from scratch. With Bootstrap, we're starting with a common foundation that is becoming very popular in web development across frameworks, not just ASP.NET. In fact, it's very popular outside of ASP.NET, which means that there are a lot of themes available for you to go and easily apply this to your site. It's also extremely simple to manipulate layout. It uses a grid-based layout system. So for the moment, you can see I have these 3 boxes, 1, 2, 3 across here. If I go back to VS and open up this page, defaulted ASPX, and I scroll down, you'll see that here are my 3 boxes, and they're all decorated with this class span4. Well, the grid system in Bootstrap is a 12-column grid system, which means that I can put as many things as I can fit into those 12 columns based on these span elements here. So I'm going to go ahead and say I actually want the first one to be a lot bigger. I want that to take up half the screen. And then I'm going to change these 2 to take up the other half evenly. And I'm going to wait for my VM to respond. I really should have brought a singer with me or something to fill in these little gaps while I wait for... There it is. Oh, there it goes. Okay, and then I'm going to do that one. Let's save that. I'm going to Alt-Tab back here, hit F5. And as simple as that, as easy as that, I can now get my layout adjusted the way I want it. If you've ever struggled with doing CSS from scratch before, it has an incredibly steep learning curve, not to mention the cross-browser issues. Using a framework like Bootstrap is going to make this stuff much, much easier for you to do. It's also responsive by default. So even though I've gone ahead and started flipping things from side to side, if I resize this browser, you can see it adjusts based on that. So see the jump there? I'm running at 1600 by 900 here, and it's utilizing a very large portion of my width, which is fantastic. If I scroll down, you can see it jumps down to a smaller grid. It's still 12 columns. It's just that the column size has been adjusted. And if I keep going still down to more of a mobile layout, you saw it jumped again, you can see my menu has changed up the top. I've now got this flyout menu. And as I've gone down to really thin, it started stacking those. It's reverted from columns to rows, essentially, and the width is disregarded. So a nice responsive layout by default using Bootstrap. So I did mention it was themable. I can go off to a website like bootswatch.com, which are free themes available for Bootstrap. And I can scroll down through any of these I like and go, wow, this one looks really nice, Cosmo. So I can click in here, download that bootstrap.css file. Thank you very much. Let me come back into here. I'm going to jump into content. I'm going to add a new CSS file. We'll call it bootstrap-theme.cs. Well, .cs. Should have been .css, shouldn't it? Let's do that again. There it is. Yes, I am not writing C#. There we go. Let's paste all that in. So now I've got my theme in here. Let's go to my bundling configuration. I'm in web form, so we're using a bundle config file, and change that from Bootstrap to Bootstrap theme. Just rebuild that. Okay, let's come back out. And Control F5 in here. And all being well, I should have a website now that looks like the theme I downloaded, which I did. Really, really simple now to change the way your default ASP.NET project looks because we have a themable CSS framework in the box for you. Now, these are free themes, but there are also a lot of premium theme sites showing up so that you can go and buy expertly designed layouts that aren't just changes of color, but are completely different layouts altogether without you having to change your markup because you're using the Bootstrap framework system. Now, if you want to learn a little bit more about Bootstrap, just do a search for it, and let me force IE, there we go. If I go to the Bootstrap site, you can see they have a lot of really nice components. They have sort of this base layout system, which can do grid-based layout or fluid layout. They also have components. So for doing things like forms, drop-downs, nice-looking buttons, all the way down to standard typography units, and also one of my favorites, where is it? Let's just have a look in the page, hey? maybe where, anyone know where the icon, here we go. Icons. Progress bars. And I can't find the icons in this page all of a sudden. Let's try the base CSS. Oh, there they are. Icons by Glyph Icons. And a whole bunch of ready-to-use icons, royalty-free, inside of your application as well. I remember back doing web development 10, 15 years ago, one of the most proud things of a web developer was finding a really good set of icons to make your application just shine. And this was when I was doing intranet, like behind the firewall stuff, which had 10 users per app. But look at the icons. They're beautiful. I spent hours looking for those. Well, now you just have a nice standard set of icons in the box, which is really, really cool. Okay. So that is one ASP.NET dialog and Bootstrap for use of theming. Let's go have a look at something else now. So we've had a system of scaffolding, this idea of doing code generation inside of ASP.NET projects ever since, I think, MVC 3. But it's been tied to MVC ever since then. And so if you were using web forms, you didn't get scaffolding available to you. Certainly not from ASP.NET team anyway. Web API also utilized the same scaffolding system when we launched that last year. But I'm happy to say that we've actually started work on a completely new scaffolding system that isn't tied to MVC or Web API. Again, as part of this one ASP.NET mantra, we're really trying to ensure that the tooling experience is consistent no matter what flavor of frameworks you might be using in your application. So I'm going to go over here. I'm going to say, let's add a model class here. Let's do something that was used to be very much an MVC demo, but I'm in web forms. I'm going to say person.cs. I'm going to add a property here, and we'll do this one as person ID. We'll do a first name, and we'll do a last name. Okay, let's build that. There's my model, nice and easy. Let's right mouse click, say add scaffold. New item in my menu right here. So now I have this new scaffolding dialog available in all ASP.NET applications that is pluggable. So I'm in a web forms application, so at the moment I'm only seeing web forms scaffolders. This is filterable as well. But as we move forward through these preview releases we're going to do, you're going to see this list fill up. And eventually you'll be able to scaffold an MVC controller into this web forms application. Okay, so there will be very little restriction about what you can scaffold into what, because it's all one ASP.NET after all. So I'm going to choose web forms, because it's the only one available to me. I'm going to type in person. I'm going to choose I want a new data context. And yes, I want to use that master page. I say, yep, let's just create a context. This is an entity framework code first context, which is going to be created for me. Hit OK. Oops, sorry. We'll let that spin up. There we go. We can see it starting to code spit stuff into the right-hand side of my application now. Let's have a look at what it generated. So you can see down here, I've got a person folder, and then basically CRUD forms. A default list for my reading, a delete, an edit, and an insert form as well. So let's just go ahead and run that straight away. Control F5 on that default page. And that's fantastic because I'm being used by another process apparently. Okay, well, let's just do the standard thing here. Very good. See if anything else is using this. Quite sure what that was all about. Beautiful. So now I have my people list. I can go ahead and create a new person. And, that was my fault. I forgot to mark this as a key. So let me go back here. And I'm going to update this attribute here with a scaffold column equals false. Now, while Entity Framework will automatically detect that that is a key, the scaffolding system, the runtime UI system of that doesn't understand that. So I have to tell it not to scaffold this at runtime. I'm going to just go ahead and rescaffold all those pages. That's because the scaffolding system is reentrant, so you can do this. I can say add new scaffold. Now that I've updated my model, I can do the exact same thing I did before. I will use the existing context because I don't need to rescaffold that, but I will say override existing pages this time and click Add. So it's going to do the same thing, but I'm going to update those 4 pages that I generated based on the fact that I did that, and it's going to throw up for me because it doesn't like that. Well, let's just do it manually then. Let's come in here. Actually, I think that's going to be fine. Let's run that. Okay, building. Let's run that up. Let's see if the demo gods are going to be with me just here. Okay, let's create a new one. Beautiful. Create myself a user, a person, I should say. Insert, and I've inserted that in. I could edit that, delete that, etc. One thing you may have noticed, if I go ahead and create a new person, these labels don't look very nice. They don't have a space in between them because it's just scaffolding out the literal property name. And if I go ahead and click Insert, there's no validation here at the moment. I can insert an empty row. Well, that's because I didn't add any validation. So let's go back to my model. And again, I'm going to annotate these properties with a few more details. I'm going to say this is required. I'm going to say display of this. We'll say name is equal to first name. And I'm going to say a string length of 32. And let's do the same for last name here. And we'll change that to last name. And all I'm going to do is recompile. Okay, recompiled. Let's come back to my app, run that again. Go through to the person folder. And we'll try creating a person again. And because I have changed my model, I have to go ahead and delete my database, so that's easy enough to do. Let's flip open SQL. Now I could go ahead and use code first migrations here and set up the project and migrate it now that I've changed my model and that type of stuff. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to blow my database away. So what application is this? The one I just created. It is June the 3rd, which is going to be these two here. Let's assume it's this one. Delete. And I'll delete this one as well, just for good measure. Okay, let's run that again. Go through to my person page. Okay, I've created new this time. You can see now that my labels have brought through the appropriate display, and if I click Insert, I get client-side validation. Now, the reason I didn't have to rescaffold is because when we generated those pages, we did so using a fantastic feature in web forms called dynamic data. Now, you may have known dynamic data back from .NET 3.5 Service Pack 1, where it was like an upfront choice and the entire application became a dynamic data application. But what a lot of people don't know is in .NET 4, we made dynamic data a lot more modular. You could just enable it for specific controls, right down to the individual field level. So what I've done here is I have a standard form view, and then you can see underneath here we have an instance of a dynamic entity. And that control will take care of generating all the UI for every field in the object that's currently being bound to in here. And you can see that up here, I'm using strongly typed data controls. Item type is set to person. The templates that are used to do that runtime generation are stored directly in your project up here, dynamic data. This was brought in by the scaffolder for me. And you can see that I have my entity templates and my field templates. So very similar to MVC, where you can change a field template or an entity template so that a date time appears the same way everywhere. It's very similar because web forms had it first, and then MVC copied it. But a lot of people don't know about it and don't use it. The scaffolding in web forms will use this by default. We really encourage people to use this because, as you can see, it makes making model changes and having a flow through to the UI really, really simple. Of course, because I'm using Entity Framework code first, it would enforce those validation attributes as well, which is kind of cool. Okay. Yes, quick question. I can take a question.
By default, those are open anyway. Is there a way to do user configuration, lock those down to certain active directory?
So the question was, by default, those scaffolds are open to anybody. Is there a way to lock those down via Active Directory to specific groups? No, not at the moment. At the moment, in this build I'm using, the only scaffolders that will show up are those that have been installed via V6 by us. Eventually, the final release of the scaffolding system will support delivery via NuGet, so you can just NuGet in a package, and it'll basically drop a scaffolder into your project folder, and then you can run that. We haven't heard about requests for locking down scaffolders to specific lists, but I can take that feedback.
Pages that are generated. Can you put security?
Oh, I'm sorry. The pages are generated themselves. You could, of course. After it's been scaffolded, you could go off and set the appropriate restrictions for those pages. Not a problem at all. The idea of a scaffold is really to do that initial code spit through the tooling, and then the runtime scaffolding, the dynamic data part of it, is just meant to sort of change and adapt based on what model you're binding to. So we have these two elements of scaffolding going on. Okay, so let's move on to web tooling updates. So web tooling updates. What have we changed in the web tooling itself in this release? First of all, we've made an adjustment to our web servers. Who knows what Cassini is? The Visual Studio Development Web Server? Well, I'm happy to announce Cassini is officially dead. Yes. So not only is it not even on this page anymore, if I drop down servers, you'll see there is no Cassini here anymore. It is not even installed on the box. So we have completely retired the Visual Studio Web Development Server, otherwise known as Cassini, because really it was quite horrible. IS Express is far superior for doing this local development type scenario stuff because it basically supports almost the entire full feature set of IIS, so it's much closer to what you're going to run at runtime. But we've also extended this not just by removing stuff, but by adding stuff. So you'll note this dialog has been redesigned slightly, and there is now this option for what we're terming an external host. So yes, you can use IIS or IS Express that comes in the box, but perhaps you want to use a custom server. Perhaps you're running Web API self-host, or perhaps you're running Nancy. Perhaps you're not using one of our frameworks, you're using another .NET web framework like Nancy or OpenRaster or choose from the long list. But you want to be able to use our web tooling and get a nice experience, but you don't want to host an IS Express. You're self-hosting on a custom server, like a Katana server, which I'll talk about in a little bit moment, or one of the other open source .NET servers. Well, you can now plug those in directly in here. What will happen is that when I NuGet in that custom server, it'll show up in the list. And if this application itself is going to be the server, which will be the case if you're doing self-host, like a self-host web API that compiles down to an exe, then the exe itself will show up in this list. You can just Control F5. It'll launch the web application project as an exe and then attach the debugger to it and start browsing to it. So who's heard of Owen and the Katana project? Anyone? A couple of hands? I'm going to talk a little bit about it at the end of the talk, just very briefly. This work is really designed to facilitate the use of OWN-compliant servers that aren't IIS. Okay? So pretty cool stuff. The other thing that's really interesting is a project or a feature code named Artery, which I'm going to show you right now. If I'm going to launch this again, let me just Control F5 this again. I've launched my browser. Ah, man, because I launched the wrong page. Let's go back to the home page. Okay. And up here on the toolbar, you'll note next to the launch button now, we have this little refresh button. And if I leave my tooltip over it, you see it says browser link. And it goes away while I walk away. It says browser link, one browser connected, Internet Explorer, currently at address // at the root of the application. Well, that's kind of cool. Well, if I go back to my default, let me pin this over here. Let me pin this over to the right. Let's hide Solution Explorer. And I'm going to go to the default ASPX for the entire site. And we'll say, hello. And then I'm going to come up here and click refresh. And it refreshed the browser on the right-hand side. If it isn't immediately apparent how significant this is, what we now have is a live connection between the web browser that's viewing the website while you're developing and the Visual Studio tool that you're using to develop it. Which means we have a channel between those two processes that we can use to collaborate and share information and even automate one side from the other. You could make changes in the browser development tool and then have that reflected back in Visual Studio immediately. F12, tweak some CSS, see your CSS file get updated. I can attach more than just IE here as well. Let me open Chrome, because I have that on this box. Let's paste in that URL. drag that over here so we can see it. Okay, so now if I go back to VS and I hover over, it says there are now 2 browsers connected, Internet Explorer and Chrome. Let's say hello again and hit refresh. And you'll see that they both refresh, which is kind of cool. So if you're doing cross-browser testing, you can quickly iterate now. Just, especially if you have multiple monitors. I don't suggest you develop like this. You'll go cross-eyed. Multiple monitors are great. Then you can make changes, and there'll be a keystroke for this. I don't know what it is, because this is like last Friday's build. And you can refresh your browsers, which is kind of cool. They are currently working on live CSS support. So if you're editing CSS in Visual Studio using the wonderful CSS tools that team has produced, as you make changes to the CSS and change the file, you'll see the CSS immediately be reflected in the page without it having to be refreshed, which is kind of cool. But we can also do kind of things like this. Let me open the Opera mobile emulator, because just running a normal browser isn't hard enough. Let's run a mobile emulator. Let's launch the Nokia N9 profile. Let's put that URL in there. There's my nice responsive layout going on. Let's go back here. Hover over. You can see I have 3 browsers connected now. I can say hello mobile. Save that. Hit refresh. And we'll see all 3 of those browser windows update. Just like that. Really, really cool stuff. Now, this is all on one machine right now, but the team also has plans to enable this remotely. So that if you were to open up your development server, IS Express, to enable remote connections, you could then launch an emulator. You could then pull out your mobile phone, say your Windows phone, connect through to the address of your machine if you enabled external connections, and this instance of the browser would be live connected to Visual Studio. So as you make changes in VS, you'll see it in the phone as well. Really, really cool technology that we can leverage moving forward to enable really great development experiences that today, let's be frank, are quite lacking in the web development space. We have this broken experience between the browser development tools and the actual tool that you do most of your work in, Visual Studio. Artery is about joining those 2 things together so that we can have one always reflect the other and so that we can enable really, really interesting experiences. Okay. No, because there isn't a feature for that yet finished. The question was, can I show an example of stuff going from the browser back to VS? This is Friday's build, and that's the only feature that currently works. You are getting the new stuff, all right? Really new stuff. Mads Christensen, who is the program manager for this feature, has prototypes that do more, and I'm hoping we'll be able to show them at build. So if you're coming to build or you better watch it online, hopefully we'll be able to show you more of this Artery goodness. I also forgot to mention it will be extensible. So if you want to write your own Artery extension that creates some crazy new browser to VS ability, you'll be able just to write some JavaScript, create a V6, drop it in, and it'll light up inside here as well. Designed to be extensible from the get-go. Okay. So that's a very quick update on web tooling. Let's move on now quickly to MVC. I know this is a whirlwind. I think I have like 7 sections in this talk, so it really is just a shotgun approach to showing you everything that we've done. So, file new project. Same file new project as everything else. Let me click MVC this time. And I'm going to go ahead and hit create project. Now, I mentioned that we're really trying to ensure that no matter what framework you use, or if you're using a mix of frameworks, so that you get a consistent tooling experience and a consistent component experience. If we build common components, that they should work across frameworks. Now, in the case of MVC, ever since MVC was released, it's always had custom tooling. You would install an MSI on your machine, on Visual Studio, and it would install a new project type flavor, which had new tooling, which meant that if you opened an MVC project on a system that didn't have that tooling installed, Visual Studio would just throw up an error saying, I can't open this project type. Conversely, if you had a web forms project and then you wanted to add MVC, which is perfectly fine at runtime, as I mentioned before, it was very difficult because that project flavor GUID wasn't in the CSproj file. It just, because you didn't create it as an MVC project, it was not an MVC project. So you couldn't get the controllers, you couldn't get the controller tooling, you couldn't get scaffolding, you couldn't get all the stuff you needed to make MVC work. Well, with MVC 5, that has all gone away. There is now no custom MVC tooling whatsoever. This is just an ASP.NET web application project. It just happens to have NuGet references to MVC. We also no longer install MVC in the GAC or any of the other components. MVC is completely local inside of these machines, inside of these project templates, and inside your machine. There is no MVC in the GAC for MVC5. MVC4 will still be in the box in this version of Visual Studio, and you'll be able to continue using MVC4, but it uses the old tooling story, the old scaffolding, et cetera, et cetera. MVC5 alone has this new tooling story. If I run it up, it has the same benefits as the Web Forms project that I just showed you before. It is also based on Bootstrap, so you get that nice common CSS and layout framework that I spoke about, and you can share themes very simply now between MVC and Web Forms because they're using the same layout framework, which is really kind of cool. The scaffolding system is the same scaffolding system that I just showed you, but with a bunch of stuff for MVC. So if I say add scaffold, now you'll notice that there isn't a scaffold controller item in this build, but rest assured, we're ensuring that the new scaffolding system will have parity feature-wise with the MVC-specific scaffolding system that used to exist or exists in MVC 4 and 3. This is a very early build, as I said, so we're just a little early on. So we can see we have a whole bunch of MVC scaffolders here, which are now showing up because I'm in an MVC project in this build. And I could go ahead and scaffold those. You can imagine they pretty much look the same as they ever have. Choose a controller name, model class, et cetera, and that all works as you're used to. One thing I didn't talk about yet on the File New project, which I'll do, I'm just going to do File New project again. Click here. Is this button down here. Configure authentication. Now, previously, what we did was give you different flavors of your project templates. This one is for intranet, uses Windows Auth. This one is for internet. It uses local username and password, and maybe Twitter and Google authentication. And if you want to do any other type of auth, like organizational auth, using federated auth, perhaps through O365 or Windows Azure Active Directory, well, you were kind of on your own, or you had to install a whole bunch of extra tooling, go through some wizards and stuff to get that set up. And again, if you didn't choose the right thing up front in your project template, it was a lot of manual process to copy it in and get it working. So now we have this configure authentication button, which is up there in the beginning when you create your project. And if I click on that, in this version of the build, we have three options. No auth, which is fine for some things. Individual user auth, which is what you would be familiar with from Visual Studio 2012. This is the local usernames and passwords using membership, plus the .NET Open Auth social login, Facebook, Google, Twitter, that type of thing. And then we have Windows Auth, which is what we had for that intranet template before. Now, this is not finished yet. We are going to add more options here, including, importantly, organizational auth. For those of you who are looking to run or already running your applications in the cloud, and you need to be able to enable your clients or your employees to sign in using their organizational credentials via federated authentication using something like O365 or Azure Active Directory, then there will be a toggle here that lets you select that, you'll go through a wizard to configure it, and then your project will be set up immediately, which is very, very cool. Not yet in this build, but will be there eventually. Backing that authentication system is a completely new auth model. I will talk to you very briefly. We're going to see more of this at build, but let me just very briefly show you. We've got a lot of feedback over the last few years that the ASP.NET membership system have become a little stale. Membership and the forms authentication system, which is what you would have used forever, introduced in .NET 2. Now, as we see more and more frameworks come out for web development on .NET that aren't tied to system web, that stalwart of ASP.NET development ever since way back in 2002, then doing cross-cutting concerns like authentication across these frameworks was troublesome. It was difficult. I wanted to do a single sign-in for my application, but my application was using Web Forms, MVC, Web API, SignalR, and enabled a mobile client, maybe an iOS app, a Windows 8 Slate app, and they all needed to be able to talk together in terms of authentication. That was very difficult to get set up. It's still very difficult to get set up. In this release of ASP.NET across our frameworks, we've developed a completely new authentication system. It's not based on Forms Auth at all. It's based on Owen, which I'll talk to a little bit about. Some people have heard of it. But essentially, it's based at a layer such that all of the frameworks, whether they run in IIS or run on self-host, if it's Web API or Signaler, they all work everywhere. Doesn't matter where you do it. And it supports the same things that you would have seen previously. So if I launch this application and I actually go to the login page, you'll see a similar experience to before where there's username and password login, and then there's this dialog, this box that says, hey, there are no authentication services currently configured. Go and see this article about how to enable them inside your application. And we did that all in the Visual Studio 2012 timeframe. While the actual code base behind that is completely new now, the experience for setting it up and using it is basically the same as it was before. The key thing to take away here is that experience is shared, that code base is shared across all of the ASP.NET family of libraries, meaning it's very easy to create these hybrid one ASP.NET style apps now. Okay, let's look at Web API. How many people are using Web API? Wow. That's great, fantastic. So I'm jumping back to my host here because I can actually do this demo inside the existing version of Visual Studio. I don't need any new tooling for this. So first thing to note is, and I actually didn't mention about MVC5, and I'll mention it now. For the new versions of all the frameworks, MVC5, Web API 2, Signaler 2, we now require .NET 4.5 on the server. Okay, we've dropped .NET 4 support. We're now utilizing features that are only in 4.5, and so all these new versions of libraries will require .NET 4.5. But that's okay because everyone's upgrading to .NET 4.5, right? Awesome. Okay, so the first feature I'm going to show you on Web API that's been added is a feature called attribute routing. Anyone heard of attribute routing? A few people. I think Scott Go did a blog post. I heard a clap. Wow, I haven't even shown you anything yet. Clap. Okay, so this is an example of attribute routing. First thing to note is that attribute routing was contributed by a community member. It wasn't even built by the ASP.NET team. This is open source at its best. We helped, of course, once it was brought into the code base. We worked with the community contributor to bring it up to the same standard as the rest of the ASP.NET code base, made sure it looked and felt the same. But ultimately, this feature was contributed by a community member, which is just fantastic. We take contributions. So attribute routing is a way of simplifying the routing system inside Web API so that rather than having a global register of all your routes, and you have to put them in one place and have your actual endpoints in a different place, with attribute routing, you can put the route information directly on your controllers and on your action methods. So the first thing you need to do, if I come over to my route config file, you can see there's no Web API route here. There's an ignore, and there's the MVC standard route, but there is no Web API default route in this application. If I go to my Web API config, you'll see I have a call to map HTTP attribute routes. This enables the attribute routing system, but I still do not have a default Web API route. There is no route in the system that is going to say, hey, this is a Web API URL just by default, and try and find a Web API that matches. No catch-all route. It's all very specific. So where do the routes live then? The routes live directly on the controller. So here's an example. On this orders controller, I have a route prefix that says for any routes that I define further down, just assume that they're all prefixed with the path segment orders. And then after that, I have HTTP GET, HTTP POST, and I have details of the tokens from the URL that I want extracted to then be injected by model binding via value providers. So very similar to what you would have seen previously, but one of the criticisms of the Web API 1 was that it was, once you started doing versioning and once you started doing very specific routing, the default route obviously just fell down very, very quickly. As soon as you wanted to control stuff, you ended up with very complex route tables that you had to ensure were in the right order and very well tested. Well, with the attribute routing, you can just decorate things directly on the controller. It's much, much easier to manage. The question is it just Web API? Yes, I believe it's just Web API. Someone correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is it's just Web API. Here's another example. So here's an example of versioning. So a common scheme when doing versioning is to change the URL, change a portion of the path in the URL so that it includes a version token. Who has done this when they've versioned their services or APIs before? Anybody? Okay. If you're doing public APIs or you're having to support multiple client types, even inside a corporation, this is quite common. So the great thing here is we have two separate controllers, but they have two of the same methods. They both honor GET requests, but they return different types. One returns customer and one returns customer 2 because we added data to it. And I can very simply version these now just by using a v1 and a v2 token in the URL. Otherwise, the URLs are identical. Here's an example of something called a nested controller. So I have a standard movies controller, which is kind of my base, but then I have a way to navigate to movies by a different entity, like an actor. So I can go /actors, some actor ID, and then get the movies for that actor, which is logically a child of the first one, but it's all contained in the same controller. So I have really, really fine-grained control of how I can organize my code versus how I organize my routes and my URLs. Traditionally, with the default web API system, these would have to be in different controllers. You'd have an actors controller and a movies controller, and you may have to share some code a different way. Or you would have to set up complex custom routes. With attribute routing, I can just put these two methods in the same controller because they're both about getting movies. It's just that one, I navigate to it directly, and the other one, I navigate to it by actor. Okay? And very similar to full routing, I can also do things like type constraints. So here, that first one, people/ID:\int, is just specifying that that token must be of type integer. I must be able to accept it as an int. So I have the same syntax that I've seen in my standard routing, but I can now apply it at the attribute routing level, which is pretty cool. So the second feature that was added by the community, which is, as I said, fairly amazing that has happened so quickly. This is just the second release of the product, and we're already getting these really major features added by the community. It's something called CORS. Who has heard of CORS? Cross-origin resource sharing. If you've ever done cross-domain AJAX, then you should know all about CORS. Without CORS, you have to resort to something like JSON-P, because by default, browsers will not enable you to make an XML HTTP request to a different domain from the one that the JavaScript was loaded into, or the one the document is loaded into, I should say. You'll just get an error. The browser just shuts it down because it's a security risk. You get cross-domain requests or cross-domain request forgery. But if you want to explicitly enable cross-domain requests, how do you go about doing it? Well, you can work around it with something like JSON-P, which is a hack, and only lets you do gets, not posts, and limits you to what you can pass through the query string and that type of thing. Or you can implement the CORS standard, which is a W3C standard that all modern browsers now support, which lets you make requests across domain boundaries as long as both parties, both the client and the server, agree that, yes, I am going to let a request be made from this URL, and I'm going to let it use these headers, I'm going to let it use this verb. So, again, we've had a very fantastic contribution from the community that gives you fine-grained CORS support. So let me start this application up. This is an application, a solution with two projects. So I've got two tabs that have been opened. Here's 43190 and 43191 in terms of the APIs. Now, the 43191 is going to be my target for the cross-origin request. Okay, so I'm going to make a request from 43190 to 43191. Because they're on different ports, they're cross-domain. I'm going to go to the API help page. Who's used the API help page? That was in 2012.2, update 2. If you haven't updated to update 2, awesome stuff. Let me go API values. I'm going to say test API. Again, this is all built in to Web API if you update to the update 2 of Visual Studio 2012. I'm going to hit send, and that gives me the ability to test that API. So you can see it works. I get a 200 OK back from the server, and here is my values as a JSON array. Well, that's great. What if I try and be a little more tricky, and I'm going to try and make that request to the other website? I can just edit the URL in this page, which is nice. I hit send. Boom. We get an error. So it says the browser has thrown that error. Network error XML HTTP request exception 101, which means, nope, CORS is not enabled. I'm shutting you down. This is a security problem. And I get no result. So let's go back to this application and configure this second project for CORS. I'm going to go into the Web API config file, which is in app start. I have a Web API config over there. I'm going to uncomment out this line, config.enable cause, and I'm passing in an instance of something that implements iCause policy provider. So you can implement whatever class you like to decide how granular you want your cause support to be, but there's a default attribute in the box that does it for you. And this is saying, well, just allow requests from anybody, that's a star, with any header, that's a star, and for any HTTP verb, that's another star. So basically, this is a fully public API. I want anyone to be able to call it from anywhere. Okay? Let's recompile that. Go back to my application. Let's hit send again. Take a little bit longer while the app compiles, and this time I get a 200 OK. So I just enable cause for the entire world, and I got 200 OK. Well, that's great, but not all the time we have fully public APIs. We want to be able to restrict who is making cross-origin calls to us based on where they came from. Well, that's where the origin header comes in. So I'm going to leave that enabled just there. So by default, everything in this application is open to everybody. And then I'm going to go into the values controller, and I'm going to make this more specific. Okay. So let's go down. I'm going to decorate. Let's do the whole controller. I'm going to say enable cause. So it's the same attribute that we saw from the global, but this was a cascading, hierarchical sort of policy. So I'm going to say I'm going to allow origins. Let's go to over this URL. I'm going to allow everything from here. And I'm going to allow empty headers, just standard headers. I'm not going to allow specific headers at this point. I'm locking it down, and I'm going to allow get requests. Let's compile that. Okay, let's come back, try it again. In theory, it should still work. Oh, doesn't work because I've made a mistake. Let me just double check my notes here. Okay, what we'll do, I think it might be that. Oh, did I put, nope, there we go. That worked. It was the trailing slash. Oh, and you're right, actually, it is the wrong port. That's interesting. It's not actually. So I'm serving from 43190. That's what I would expect to get. Okay, let's just ignore that demo. Let's move on to the next one. Let's make this star. Okay. And what I want to do this time is try a different header. So if I come back to the help page, you'll see that I can add a header here, which is kind of nice. So I'm going to add x-foo with the value of bar. Let's come back here and just make sure I compiled this. I'm going to comment that out because that seemed to cause all the problem. And I'm going to hit, let's delete that. Let's just make sure it works. Yep, that works. So let me add my custom header. So now I'm making a request, but I'm adding a header to it. Let's say send. That works. Let's lock it down a bit. And you know what? Let's just do it at this level because I know that seems to work. So if I just say I'm only going to allow the origin header and not carte blanche any other header, then if I hit send this time, because I'm sending that custom header, I get an error. Okay? So if I want to be very fine-grained about what I support, I can include specifically the origin header and the x-foo header. Now, you need the origin header because it's part of the cause spec. If you don't include the origin header, then nothing works at all. Trust me, because I spent 20 minutes last night trying to figure it out. You must include the origin header. So now if I go back and try that again with my x-foo header, now that I've recompiled, you see that it works. So I can be very explicit about where the request comes from, and it can use wildcards and subdomains, that type of thing, and what headers I accept, and also the methods. Now I'm doing a get here, and you can lock it down to post and that type of thing as well, or any verb that you like. So really, really nice, fine-grained support for cause built into the box now as a result of a fantastic contribution from the community. So bravo to the person who did that. Are they here? That's a shame. I would call you out and shake your hand. Okay, so there are a couple of other things that have been added in Web API that I'm not going to demo. I'll just quickly talk to. There's been new OData support. So if you're using OData on Web API, using the features that we included in that update 2 again. Go get update 2. We've extended that support with $select, $expand, $batch, and $value. I know nothing about OData, but if that means anything to you, good stuff. Support for API batching. So this is quite useful. If you have a client that's going to make multiple requests to the server, because you have API 1, 2, 3, and 4, and you generally call them together, you can now issue those 4 requests and have them batched up into a single HTTP request. And they'll be unbatched on the server side, executed separately, and then returned in a single response. Okay? Really, really nice feature that lets you have granular APIs, but call them in batches. The new auth system, which I spoke about, that enables not only the social login and that type of stuff that we've seen before, but if I then want to go and add a rich client to this, maybe a mobile app or something like a Windows 8 Store app, I'm going to have to call out to this application via HTTP, obviously, but I first need to authenticate. Now, those devices don't use cookies when you're writing those apps. You generally need to send a custom header to do the authentication. And again, today in Web API 1, there was no support out of the box to do that. You had to write it yourself. In Web API 2, support for that is going to be in the box, which includes both the token generation service, so that inside your application, if a mobile app says, hey, please tell me what methods of authentication you support, Google, Facebook, local login, so you can show appropriate UI. And then once you click that and go through the cycle of logging in, generate me a token, a big string of random characters, that I can then use by pasting in a custom header every time I make an API call so that the poor SAP on the other end doesn't have to enter their username and password every time. Okay? That will be built in by default. That's a very large demo, so I don't have time to do that today, but you will see more of that at build, and if you're interested in Web API, make sure you check out Dan Roth's session here at TechEd. Yes? The question was, does the batching feature support the unit of work pattern? I honestly don't know. I can find out for you. I mean, unit of work is a fairly generic kind of term, so I don't know if you're talking about a specific implementation or not. That would be a great question for Dan Roth, so if you're interested in Web API in more detail, I strongly recommend you go to his sessions while you're here at TechEd. Okay, 2 more things. Owen self-host. So anyone here self-hosting a Web API? A few people. Okay? Today, the self-host story for Web API uses WCF. In Web API 2, it'll use the Owen host layer. So if you want to self-host SignalR on top of the same process, you'll be able to very easily do that now. And because all the auth stuff I just talked about is based on Owen middleware, it just plugs in whether you're running on IIS or on self-host, and it's portable across the two, which is great. And lastly, the Microsoft.NET team released a portable client library version of the HTTP client. So if you're writing phone apps or Silverlight apps, .NET 4, 4.5, Windows Store apps, you now have a consistent HTTP client library story via NuGet. You can get that at microsoft.net.http. That'll be on a slide later. Okay, SignalR 2. Let me go back to my VM. Okay. So SignalR 2, to be totally honest, is not a lot to talk about right now. It's still very early days. Let me quickly create an application. Same server requirement. So we're dropping .NET 4.0 support, moving to .NET 4.5 for SignalR 2. We have new item templates in the box. So if you're using SignalR and Visual Studio, you're creating hubs and connections and those type of things. If I go over here and say Add New Item, you'll see now SignalR Hub Class V1, SignalR Hub Class V2. So we have 2 versions of SignalR. You see Web API Controller 1 and 2 there as well. SignalR 2.0 has much tighter integration with Owen, which results in 2 things. Fewer dependencies, so there's less assemblies in your application, which is always good, and less NuGet packages. And also that unified authentication and Owen-based configuration. So the way you configure your startup of your application is now via the Owen primitives, iApp Builder. Now, if you're not familiar with any of this, don't worry. You'll become familiar with it as we do more preview releases and finally in RTW for this stuff later in the year. But the takeaway is it makes our frameworks easier to use together. You configure them together in the same place. They share common components via the same pipeline, and it doesn't matter whether you host it in IIS or in your custom XE or in a custom server. Everything should just work if it's all talking Owen. We also have a .NET Portable Class library for Signaler 2. So again, if you're doing Silverlight 5, Windows Phone 8, Windows Store apps, you get the same client experience for all of those. We have got a Xamarin client. Anyone using Xamarin in here to build iOS, Android, Mac apps with .NET? Signaler 2.0 will have a Xamarin client, so you can use Signaler inside of your Xamarin iOS, Android, and Mac applications, which I think is just fantastic. If you don't know about Xamarin, I strongly encourage you to go and check out Xamarin. That's Xamarin. And finally, we are working on a C++ client for Signaler 2 as well, C++ for Windows. So if you're writing native applications on Windows, whether they're for the desktop or for the store using XAML, then there'll be a C++ client available for you as well. Okay, next demo, ASP.NET Identity. That's enough talking. So I mentioned that we have an entirely new system for doing identity and authentication. We've had this ASP.NET membership system for a very long time. It served us well, but in this new world of one ASP.NET, it just wasn't good enough. We needed to build something new, and so that's what we've done. I have a brand new web forms application here, and what I'm going to do is go on and start showing you and customizing this new system. Quick few things about what's so great about it. It's based on claims, so if you used a claims-based system before, you'll know what that means. It's basically a generic way for all authentication systems, whether you're being authenticated by one provider or another, to make claims about the current user, which you can assert against, which is fantastic. It's async from top to bottom and unit test friendly, which was one of the criticisms we had with the auth story that we shipped in MVC4. It's completely pluggable, so that if you have custom stores that aren't SQL-based, if you want to be able to hook up your user profile management to something that isn't exposed by a database, maybe a web service, everything is pluggable in this new system. Absolutely everything. And it's very modular. So you can remove the pieces that you don't want. You can just use one or two of the pieces. You don't have to use all 7 or 8 of them, okay? If you want the happy path, you can use the default implementations. If you want to pull it apart because you like the way we do token generation, but you don't like the way we do user management, you can just plug in your own pieces. That's absolutely fine. Okay, and what I'm about to show you, it's very, very easy to extend the base concept of a user. So if I go into my identity config file, there's a whole bunch of setup in this build at the moment. In the final build, this file will be much, much simpler. In fact, it's going to go down to sort of less than 5 lines of code. At the moment, there is quite a lot of code in here because this is as I said, very, very recent build. Not everything's been integrated yet. But the thing to take away is that all these things here are pluggable. Logins, users, secrets, roles, role claim type, user ID claim, username claim, and the claim issuer. These are all the pluggable components of this new system that we've built from the ground up. You can see that the default implementation for storage is using Entity Framework code first, which makes it very simple for me to do things like modify what's going to get shown up. So I can see here that I have a type called user. If I F12 into that, I can see it's a class in my project, which is kind of cool. Okay. Okay, I'm going to run the app, and I'll go ahead and do registration, like you saw me do before, which will force the database to be created. Because we're using EF code first, all that will be taken care of, obviously. So let's register. Let's create Damien Edwards, super complicated password, hit register. Okay, very, very cool. So I'm logged in as Damien Edwards. If I click on there, similar to what we saw in Visual Studio 2012 templates, I can change my password. If I'd configured authentication for Twitter or Google, I could go ahead and change that here. But what I want to do in this application is add more details to the user profile. I want to prompt users for more information when they sign up to my site. By default, all we ask for is username and password. I'm going to ask for birth date as well. So let's close this. Let me do this the very, very easy way. So I just have a class here. It's EF code first. So let's just go and add a property. I have to make sure I do this in the right order. Okay, so I'm going to enable migrations. Let's bring up my package manager console, which is already there. I'm going to say enable migrations. Let me zoom this up a bit because it's a bit hard to see. This is going to enable code-first migrations for my application using Entity Framework. So I'm going to manage even the built-in user management, membership type system is itself going to be managed with EF Code First and migrations. That's been enabled. It says it found an existing database, and so it created me an initial migration. I want to go ahead and enable automatic migrations. It's currently false, so I'm going to set that to true and rebuild. So let's go back and add that property now that I have migration set up. We'll say prop date time nullable called birth date. And we'll build. Recompiled. Let's go back to my console and add a migration for this new field that I've added to my model. So we'll say add migration. Let me zoom in a bit. That's probably still not big enough for you. There we go. Add migration. We'll call it user birth date. So EF is going to detect the changes in the model. It's going to generate me a new migration file. You can see that over here on the right-hand side in my migrations folder. There it is, user birth date. Now if I open that up, you can see it's very simple. When I go up, it adds a column called birth date. When I go down, it removes a column called birth date. Very, very simple, but it's been done for me, which is really, really nice. Who hasn't used migrations before? Like, who has not ever seen this? Okay, great. I hope you're looking at this and going, oh, this is kind of neat. I could use this in my application. Okay, now that I've done that, I need to tell it to actually go and update the database. I have the code in my application that'll do the migration, but I have to actually tell it to go and do it. So it knows the current state of the database. It knows that it only has the initial migration applied, so it's going to go and apply the new migration, which is user birth date, which is done. So now my database, in theory, is up to date. Let's go and update my UI so that I can actually capture this information. So let's go to my account register page. Now, in this version of the project template, all this is a little bit manual, hoping to clean this up to use, for web forms customs I'm talking about, to use model binding. So this won't be quite as manual as it is right now. So I'm going to just copy this block of HTML here. Come down here, we'll paste that in. Let's go ahead and change the things. This is going to be birth date. Let's change what it says. This will be, not birth date. Birth date. Let's call this one birth date. Control to validate will be, I'm detecting a pattern here. The birth date field. And I want this to be a compare validator. I'm going to say type is equal to date, and I'm going to say operator is equal to a check, data type check. I'll say the data date field must be a valid date. Okay, so let's go into the code behind. Update this code here to actually capture that. So let's do that. Again, this is the sort of code that gets really, really easy once you set up a web forms application or even an MVC application if you're not using it to use model binding. Okay, so it basically writes this code for you at runtime, which is really kind of cool. So let's declare a variable here, date time, birth date, and then inside here, my user's being created. I'm just going to reformat this so we can see it a bit better. Let's set that birth date field equal to birth date is not equal to date time dot min value. Then we're going to go ahead and set it to the birth date that we got from the form. Otherwise, we're going to set it to a nullable date time. Let's compile that. Watch it fail because I typed something wrong. Oh, because I don't need that, because that's a property assignment. There we go. Okay, let's launch. I did recompile that. I did. Let's launch the app again. Not that one. Oh. And I'll sign up with I'll do a different registration this time. Now that I've got my extra page, my extra field, I should say. So there's my extra field, birth date. Let's do Damien Edwards 2. Super complicated password 2. Put my birth date in. Yes, that is my birth date. Hit register. Okay, so it seems to have worked. Let's go and check that it actually did. I'm going to bring up the SQL Server tools in here. Let's just pin that there. We'll zoom in a bit so we can see what we're doing. I need to refresh this to see the one I just created. Okay, so I am going to guess this is the one down. Who wants to guess which one this is? That one? The latest one that was created on June? Let's find out. Tables, there's my users, that's a good sign. There's my columns, does it contain a birth date column? It does, that's a good sign. So let's look at the data inside here. And you'll see there's my first user I created before I had birth date, and there's the second user I created after I had a birth date. So if you've ever used the profile management system in ASP.NET before with membership, and you tried to do this type of thing, you'll know how hard it used to be. Custom classes, custom profile providers, that type of thing. Now that everything is based on EF Code First by default, you can change that if you want to. It was very easy for me just to take the user class as it existed in the project by default, add a property to it, update my UI. If I'd been using model binding or dynamic data, that would have updated automatically. I wouldn't have even had to do that code. And then I can now capture that information very simply and associate it directly with the user account that is also used to log this person in. Really, really nice. There is a lot more to come in this system. So this is just the beginning. This is a really very early look at the identity system that we're working on. We're going to add a lot more features to this to make it a really fully featured identity management system for your application, password reset, all that type of stuff that you're used to. But while remaining unit test friendly, async top to bottom, and also very modular, so you can pick and choose what you want. You can pick the system out, take it out of a web forms application and run it in a Nancy application if you want to, because there's no tie to the system web world. This is a really nice portable set of libraries that we've built. Okay, let's flip back to slides to recap and talk about the last few things. So one ASP.NET and templates. So brand new project dialog, one dialog for creating all flavors of ASP.NET application now, so you can mix and choose and build those hybrid applications. Your authentication system is configurable at project creation time and will be extended with more options as we move forward. We saw the use of Bootstrap for layout and styling and how easy it was to grab a different theme from a public website and apply that to my application straight out of the bat, and also how to change the layout using that nice grid layout system while still maintaining good responsive design for small monitors, big monitors, and even mobile devices. A completely new scaffolding system, again, built with this one ASP.NET vision in mind. Works across all of our frameworks, will be pluggable so you can build your own code generators, either publish them internally or to NuGet so that people can take advantage of the great work being done in the community. Updates to Visual Studio Web Tooling, the death of Cassini, long live IIS Express, now the default option in the box. Support for custom web servers if you're doing Owen or Katana project-based hosting or self-hosting web API. And the live browser updates via that codename artery feature that I saw, where the browsers and Visual Studio are actually connected in real time. And so I can make changes in VS, have them auto-refresh in my browsers, and build extensions so that I can move data back and forth to enhance the development experience. ASP.NET MVC5, .NET 4 support is dropped. Now requires .NET 4.5 on the server. No more MVC-specific tooling. It now just uses the new scaffolding system, the new project template dialog, and NuGet to do all of its package management, the same tools that you use in any flavor of ASP.NET. ASP.NET Web API 2, lots of changes. .NET 4.0 support dropped, now requires 4.5. Fantastic open source contributions in the guise of attribute routing and the core support for doing granular control across domain requests. The new OData support, new auth system including a token server if you're building cross-device rich applications that are service-oriented. Batching support, Owen-based self-host for doing easy composition of multiple .NET web frameworks on one host, even if they don't come from this team. And the portable HTTP client for calling into your web APIs from smart clients, devices, and whatnot. ASP.NET Signal R2, again, dropping 4.0 on the server, moving to 4.5. Much tighter Owen integration, which simplifies the dependency stack, makes the applications much more portable, so you can move them to self-host and back to IIS very simply. Lets you configure middleware, common auth between Web API, SignalR, and other Owen-compliant frameworks. Lots and lots of bug fixes in Signal R 2.0. Portable class library client for Silverlight 5, Windows Phone 8, and Win 8. Xamarin client, which is huge. If you're doing mobile development on iOS, building native apps on iOS, Android, or Mac, you can now do so using C#, using the Xamarin suite of products, and we have a Xamarin client ready in 2.0. And a C++ client for those doing native development on Windows. We do have a future view to even enabling C++ for embedded devices. But that's post 2.0, because a lot of people have asked me that every time I talk about SignalR. It is on the roadmap. New ASP.NET Identity System, completely new from the ground up. ASP.NET Membership, legacy. ASP.NET Forms Auth, legacy. Keep using it. There's nothing wrong with it if it's working for you today. But if you want to build these new types of one ASP.NET applications, or you already have a hybrid and you've been struggling with the limitations with Forms Auth and Membership, or you've written your own custom membership providers, you might be interested in this. Completely new, cross-framework, and authentication and user management, async and unit test friendly, addressing two of the biggest levels of feedback we had from MVC4. Pluggable, completely and modular, so you can pick and choose which pieces you want to use and replace the bits that you don't like. And you saw me do that very simple extension of a user profile. So very quickly on Owen and Katana, I keep bringing up these terms. If you don't know what they are, go and search for Katana on the Channel 9 video site. Howard Durking, who's the program manager for Katana on the ASP.NET team, just did a great talk on Channel 9. So an hour, you can learn all about what Owen and Katana is all about and why you're going to hear us talk a lot more about it as we move forward. It's all about flexibility, performance, composability, cross-framework, cohesion, and all those nice buzzwords. It's a standard for connecting servers to frameworks, allows us to unify the host story for all of our frameworks, and have common modules, which we call middleware in the Owen world, so that you can do things like have common concerns like authentication and logging and dependency injection and composition. All those things can be common across all frameworks and just be injected into the HTTP request pipeline via these middleware components. Entity Framework 6. This is the only thing I'm going to talk about EF6 because it's such a huge topic that there are specific talks about it here at TechEd. But async query and save, custom code first conventions to control how your code first turns into actual databases. Code first mapping to stored procedures for those of you who are using Sprox. Connection resiliency, so handle when the database goes up and down while you're in the middle of doing an operation. Dependency resolution, so that you can now inject in pieces of EF. You can replace pieces of EF in one place because it now does dependency injection. Code-based configuration. Configuration migrations of the history table. So you saw me use migrations just now. I'm not able to change currently how EF manages that migration. That will now be manageable in the next version. And finally, I'll be able to have multiple contexts per single database, which is fantastic support. You couldn't get that neat. So now we can do framework composition. I can pull in a framework from NuGet that uses EF to do data management, and I can point it at the same database that I use to store my data, and now both of those contexts can work on the same database. Previously, that wasn't supported. That's my Twitter handle. If you want to ask me questions or whatever, please grab me at Damien Edwards. I'm also damien.edwards@microsoft.com. There is a lot more to come at Build. This is just a preview of what we've been working on today. As always, these are some slides I've never seen that were added by the slide people. Great. Fill out your evals, win a car, all that type of stuff. Great resources. I mentioned Channel 9. Please do check out Channel 9. The ASP.NET team is trying to frequently post updates there about the stuff we're working on. So thanks for coming.